This podcast is brought to you in association with SAP Concur. SAP Concur helps businesses of all sizes optimize their spend processes with intelligent expense, travel, and invoice solutions. To find out more, visit concur.co.uk. And welcome to the Forward-Looking Finance Leader, a special three-part podcast series produced by AccountingWEB in association with SAP Concur. We've arrived at our terminus, folks, the grand finale, episode 3, Invoice, Fraud and Cybercrime. How can AP protect the business? Barely a day goes by now, it seems, without news of a hack or a leak. In general, the cyber risk to businesses in the UK remains enormous. 2 in 5 British businesses were victims of cybercrime in 2018, according to the government. Increasingly, your email inbox and your invoice procedures are ground zero for costly scams targeting CFOs, FDs, and finance teams in general. These attacks are on the rise, so how can finance leaders insulate the business and themselves from the criminals? My name is Francois Bodenost. I'm the business editor of AccountingWEB. I'll be your host, and I'm joined by an excellent air ambulance. David, how are you doing?
Hi, very well, thank you, very well.
Thank you for joining us. I've got Adam Harling, who is the managing director of Netitude, a provider of cybersecurity and managed IT services.
Good morning.
And last but not least, I've got Natalie Gwilt, who is the Senior Director of Account Management at SAP Concur. I understand you've got lived in Belgium?
Yes, good morning, Francois. Yes, it's a little bit bizarre. About 30 odd years ago, David was a little boy growing up in a base in Belgium, and I was an adult there. Our paths never crossed, but our parents actually knew each other and worked together.
Yeah, so a bit of a surprise that one, don't
Each other and worked together.
Yeah, so a bit of a surprise that one, don't. When you sort of say you've lived in Belgium for 3 years, you don't normally come back and work out that your parents know each other, but occasionally you do.
Yeah.
And now the podcast has brought you together. it's like fate.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you for joining us, guys. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
So let's get cracking. I guess Adam, let's start with you. I mean, all this talk of whaling and fishing, it sounds like Moby Dick at this point. But could you give us a little bit of perspective? What is whaling? What is fishing?
Okay, so fishing is the method often used to gain credentials or access to your email system or your network system.
It's the most common one, isn't it?
It's the most common. 90 to 95% of breaches start with a phishing attack and gaining credentials via that method. That's often then used to launch a whale phishing attack, and that will be targeting people with authority to make payment after an exchange, possibly a fake invoice, often with backs or payment details changed between the two parties. In some cases, these are really, really well crafted, with even the language used between the two parties being a part of that attack. Or used in the attack. So the difference is phishing, gaining credentials, whaling, going for the big money.
Going one deeper, almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think with the sort of whaling and phishing attacks, it's something that if you speak to any finance department now, they'll be familiar with. Ideally, a lot of the IT systems will block out a lot of these emails, but you always find some coming through. And historically, it might have been pretty obvious, just a sort of blank email saying it's from your CEO or something when it clearly didn't look that believable to see, and it won't always now be coming from your CEO to your finance director, but it'll be coming from the PA to the CEO to the finance manager, where they think they'll perceive to be greater weaknesses. Yeah. So these attacks are getting more sophisticated all the time.
Natalie, I mean, you've got a very interesting vantage point because you deal with all sorts of businesses and clients. I mean, how big of a concern is it to you?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of organisations might not want to wash their dirty washing in public, just because they don't want to be known or seen to be a threat. But the customers that I spoke to our Fusion event this week, because of specifically knowing I was coming to talk to you about this today, they said that since they've automated and they've got a lot more compliance and control in place, that they have not seen, or they've seen a much lower level of attack coming their way, because they've got processes and systems in place which help prevent these people getting through the net. David, you must have seen this.
Definitely. I think it's become so common. It's interesting in the charity sector because charities very much based around reputation. So, but it's also transparency is vitally important as well. Because as a charity, if you're not comfortable in being clear and transparent about what you're doing, then you have to ask if that's the right thing to be doing. So transparency is essential, but I think it is a difficult question about talking about it because people are concerned that it will make you look cases, and actually I think often when people sort of talk about it and talk about the attacks, the response tends to be it does happen and it is out there, and it's actually, if you're not picking up on it, then it's probably happening, you're not aware of it. So actually recognizing that it's there and you're taking action as far as you can to stop it is normally seen as a positive. But it's an interesting dynamic how prepared people are to speak about it.
Adam, there's an interesting point now that we've already talked about here in terms of we think about cybercrime, or we think about invoice fraud, these kinds of things. We immediately think about there is the technological element, but there's also like the people element there, isn't there?
Absolutely, that would be our headline approach to cybercrime is people training. There's some fantastic tools available, products like Know Before, where it will actually phish your users. It will show you who's opened the email, and you can target your training for those users. So that's an excellent product and approach.
That's when we use ourselves actually, and find it
Yep.
incredibly effective.
Yep.
Is that like a form of penetration testing?
Not really. It's a platform to send essentially phishing scams to your users, and then you track which ones opened it, and then target.
There's the people element there too, but I mean, in terms of like a tool like SAP Concur, how does an invoice management tool like that help people kind of deal with like bogus invoices or like cybercrime?
It helps you manage the control of your suppliers, but I think, David, as our customer, you've probably got the first-hand experience of using the tool.
I think one of the massive things, it just adds more structure. Around the controls in place, and that itself reinforces the culture. I think it's particularly important in a modern environment where lots of people will work out of the office. When we were using our Know Before testing, what we're expecting before was that we were hoping it'd be quite strong in the office because it's talked about, people are in the office, people are aware about it. But we've got 18 shops, which obviously people predominantly out on the shop floor. When they're there checking emails, it's quite, it's not the primary duty there. They want to get back to the shop floor. We thought that would be where a lot of emails would sneak through. It was interesting that didn't prove the case. We're quite happy with that. But it's those kind of remote locations where it might not always be on top of people's awareness. So just having that infrastructure there, it encourages the culture so people know what to look for. Because as we've touched on, the biggest weakness is always the actually having the controls in there so that if something does come in, it has to go through a number of steps, number of controls. So using Concur, it guarantees it will follow the review process. It's once you've got a clear process like that, workarounds shouldn't happen. When it's more paper based, it's easy to accept workarounds because that's not a computer. Easy to accept workarounds because that's not a computer saying no, you can't do that, hasn't been authorized yet. So it just enforces those controls and the mentality, and that it's interesting. I think we're talking a lot about external fraud, etc. But it's always worth being aware of the internal fraud, which again any sort of fair-sized organisation unfortunately be naive to think that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and that's something that I know SAP Concur is really big in helping with is essentially false expenses and so on.
Yes. So anything that goes through our invoice or our expenses, they outsource that auditing function to us, and that does really help cut down on the risk of fraud. And I must admit, over the years we've probably built up quite a good case study of stories that are quite interesting and also quite funny, but quite incredulous at times. But people do try whichever sector that you work in, not everybody's the person who doesn't have the same high moral standards that most of us might have.
And I think it's a particular, it's again interesting in the charity sector, because people in the charity sector tend to be very trusting. And actually, to be a professional, good organisation, it's good to inherently trust the people you work with. But there also has to be that bit of reality there as well, to recognise that things aren't always like. And it's I think the fraud triangle is quite an interesting concept, which sort of develops the three things that people highlight as sort of needed for fraud to take place, which is the opportunity, the rationalisation, and the pressure. And by having good controls, you're taking away the opportunity. Pressures will often be external. So again, having clear structure should relieve some internal pressure, but that will have to be an external factor. But it's that rationalisation step, and it's fascinating that a lot of people who do commit fraud, particularly internally, they will have to rationalise it to some degree. And even when people are caught in all kinds of trouble, they still see themselves as the victim after committing fraud. So that rationalisation process, internal fraudsters aren't necessarily bad people as such. It's just they've put it in their mind that it's a legitimate, fair thing to do.
And in terms of policies, Adam, so if I look at my own office, we're a very trendy media company, and we have things like bring your own device. What kind of threat does that pose?
Currently, in the kind of SME or SMB world, BYOD is a huge problem. There's a lot of data on unmanaged devices, so there needs to be a good BYOD policy in place. It needs consideration, and taking advantage of fairly new technologies such as MAM, mobile application management, so you can sandbox the data that's on your BYOD devices if you deem BYOD an approach you want to take.
Yeah.
But it does need careful consideration, and it's often not.
Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, like
Often not.
yeah, it's tricky. I mean, like you're working in a coffee shop and you're kind of just using the Wi-Fi. You're accessing systems that you probably maybe shouldn't.
Yeah, and I think it just again, because the modern way of working, it just naturally flows out of where you're going. So then it's easy to have that unplanned and unstructured. I think you're spot on saying it does need to be planned. Those policies are absolutely crucial to have those controls in place. So I think it's a bit of it's something people don't always put as much thought into as they need to.
That's a critical point, isn't it? The sort of cultural element, which is, as a finance leader, ensuring that every single member in your team, and leading by example, uses the IT infrastructure.
Around fraud, it tends to be sort of culture-based. It's absolutely crucial. We discussed the people element. We find for ourselves, we're quite fortunate in a way, that as an aviation entity, obviously with our air ambulance helicopter, we use a just culture, which is quite familiar in the aviation sector, which is all around encouraging people to admit to honest mistakes and actually sort of near misses, things like that, and actually be quite open, just to make sure that those are discussed and not hidden, and then can then be responded to. But making it clearly understood that deliberate omission, deliberately working outside the system, things like that aren't accepted, and that's really healthy in the aviation sector to have a really safe environment. But we use that throughout our charity as well, and that means that people should be comfortable in highlighting if there's near miss, if they do things wrong, but understanding as well that they can't step outside the processes. So having that just culture is so useful for us.
It's an important factor in cybersecurity, actually. If you enforce, if the enforcement is too strict, you'll find people find methods around it, and that's another problem in itself.
Yeah.
I mean,
with sort of invoices wise, things like that. It's just being able to pick up things like in the past we've had duplicate invoices go through, for example. So if that happens, actually people sort of saying, oh, a duplicate invoice has gone through, rather than just hiding it away and trying to remove it and it's not get, so it's gone through, rather than just hiding it away and trying to remove it and it's not get, so we can then say, why did that happen? And that happens a lot less now using Concur, because the system automatically flags it. So again, this move towards having a system which is automated should isolate and bring out a lot of those problems. But if occasionally for some reason one does go through, then it's questioning it, why did you ignore the flag or something like that. Actually encouraging people to be honest and sort of say, well, that's why I did it, I was in a rush or whatever. Right, okay, that's a human error. We just need to make sure that's not not done, or if there's some other reason, then we can sort of look into that, the root cause analysis, and work around it. So it's those kind of issues like that, really.
If you don't have the right infrastructure in place, Natalie, in terms of technology, how easy is it for something like a duplicate invoice to kind of slip through the net?
That's one of our favourite subjects, actually,
Yeah.
because organisations that aren't automated, the risk of duplicate invoices or paying false invoices that aren't actually genuine for that business is so much higher. So by putting controls and policies and procedures in place, using software, trust is obviously really very key, and I think that we've just talked about that. But you as an organisation, when you're audited by your auditors, you need to be able to demonstrate that you have got robust controls in place, and that's exactly what software such as the Concur platform can do to help you control and manage those risks.
There's a sort of interesting theme developing in the course of our conversation here, in terms of like there's the malicious aspect to people just make mistakes and errors and so on. So Adam, when these sorts of non-malicious mistakes kind of pile up and the kind of psychological pressure kind of builds up, we talked earlier about the kind of people element of cybersecurity. Does when offices and businesses are feeling the pressure of kind of making these rudimentary errors, does it make it easier, or are they more easily targeted by criminals?
I'd say so, yes. Obviously, all of the awareness and culture stuff needs to be augmented with antivirus, patching, good firewalls. All those pieces need to be in place as well to catch the pieces that fall through the net, through the people net.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's quite noticeable that really fraudsters are quite happy to target everyone and anyone. Again, I was sort of saying the charity sector, people tend to be quite trusting, but fraudsters don't think, well, I don't mind taking that money away from. Actually, that'd be unfair to do that, taken away basically from patients and where the service is going to go. They just see it as cash, which they want to get. And they often actually see charities they'll perceive as weaker controls. So charity sector certainly see a lot more focus on fraudsters targeting the charity sector, but they target every sector now.
Yeah. Are there any new trends developing? Anything that you've spotted recently?
Internet of Things is probably the next. Internet of Things is probably the next phase of cybersecurity issues. So smart home devices, smart building devices, they're often installed poorly. So even printers now are an attack vector, and they're often installed with default username and password. This innocuous those devices you're installing. That's probably one thing that I would say is probably on the rise.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I think we've certainly seen just the complexity of things like, for example, some of the emails we discussed earlier. And we had one actually a couple of weeks ago which came in, and we just about picked up and controlled. But it was a very easy to miss one. So it was actually an email that came from someone we work with, a work associate, an external person we work with. It actually came from their email address. The person had a meeting with the person that the email was sent to a couple of days before, and it was saying, following on from our meeting, here's an attachment for things we discussed, and with the right footer and header and all that kind of thing. If you're at a conference and you see that and you're expecting to get something through from that person and you're catching up on your emails, it's so easy to click on that. And that, I think, was actually, after a bit of investigation, that was actually a sort of programmed attack. So it wasn't somebody packing into it, looking at it and sending it out. That was all coded and just done automatically. So it was fascinating to see that, but a little bit scary. But yeah, so they're just coming a lot more complex, the attacks.
And well crafted. They are. They take the ones that are hand they use between themselves.
Yeah.
Slang, nicknames. It's pretty convincing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Artisanal.
Yeah. Artisanal hacking.
Yeah.
Anything to do with these type of risks, if it becomes a big issue within a business, then you've obviously got reputational damage to think of as well as an organisation, because you might not have looked for that, it found you.
Yeah.
But then if something large gets out and you become known as the organisation that suffered from this attack and didn't pick up on it, then organisations that are looking to buy from you will be your customer also. It's a vicious circle, isn't it?
In the charity sector, reputation's everything. If you lose your reputation, then you've got a big struggle to win it back.
Yeah. How do you sleep at night?
By being very good at what we do.
Yes, absolutely. Good answer.
It's an interesting Venn diagram that, and it's one that crops up again and again on AccountingWEB actually. And it's one that crops up again and again on AccountingWEB actually. It's where like the finance role, which is usually so insulated from the outside world in many respects, but as soon as something goes wrong, it becomes a bit of a PR nightmare. So like it's probably the one part of the business where if something goes wrong, it's guaranteed to be like a major blow to the business reputation.
Understandably, always a sensitive area.
Yeah.
For us certainly. Every donor gives us money expected to be spent on our patients, and that's exactly what we aim to do. And so our whole strategy is based around. We start at the patient outcomes. How can we improve the patient outcomes? We don't sort of start at the budget and say how much money we've got. What we want to improve the patient outcomes and work back how much money that will take. Okay, now to fundraise, how to gain that. So it's an absolute key focus, and the donors are perfectly correct in expecting money to be spent on our improving patient outcomes. So if they see it going somewhere else, then they want to know why and understand it, definitely.
Guys, I think we could keep going on this topic for a very long time, and by the sounds of things, like the hackers are getting increasingly ingenious, and the mistakes are increasingly more rudimentary. But hopefully we've diagnosed and offered some good solutions already. And before we leave, guys, I guess we can just go around. And do we have any final recommendations for businesses that want to be really watertight? Adam?
I would say the government-backed Cyber Essentials standards is a great first step for SMEs. It's probably not the last word in cybersecurity, but it does improve the standard. The balance too far away from usability. So there's that, and I'll say it again, invest in training, awareness is really the key.
How can businesses access Cyber Essentials? What's the...
Cyber Essentials, Google it. It's a government-backed standard. It's a certification process. There's two levels, Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus. Cyber Essentials is actually self-certification, but it means that you ask the questions that you need to ask of your own organisation, and Cyber Essentials Plus is an audited certification.
Great. Natalie, any recommendations?
Well, I'm remiss if I didn't say find a software platform such as the one that we have at SAP Concur to help you manage and control, but make sure it's a reputable one with a good suite of security to protect the information that you are putting within that platform.
Great, thank you, David.
Yeah, well, I think I'd reiterate the Cyber Essentials. I think none of us are immune to fraud, and it's just making sure you're in a position that if something does happen, that you be comfortable with what controls and what things you put in place. And I think that's kind of the bare minimum. And then also the human side as well. So really thinking about that. On our side, we've done some bits recently internally around identifying risk from the bottom up and not just top down. So the risk register isn't something that just sticks with trustees, but actually when team meetings are talking about it, thinking about it. One of the most one things we think will be highly effective into our monthly one-to-one process, 2 concerns. So people are forced to actually raise 2 concerns each week, and that might be a health and safety concern, it might be about the workload, it might be something really small, or just about a breakout area or something like that, or it could be something much more key, for example around fraud or whatever. Thinking throughout the organisation about these kind of things builds up the culture, and as we've said a few times, that people element is so key. We need to be talking about it at all levels.
Great stuff. That is the final podcast in our series. If you've listened all the way through, thank you for coming along with us on our Odyssean journey. It's been a pleasure. I've been Franz Bardenwas, and thank you to Adam, Natalie, and David.
Pleasure.
You've been wonderful guests.
Thank
you
you
very much,
Thank
guys,
you.
and have a good day.
too.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Okay.
This podcast is brought to you in association with SAP Concur.
SAP Concur helps businesses of all. To find out more, visit concur.com.